A while ago, I did a ranking list for the WCW games that I played, and I decided that it was time to do one for the WWF games. This is going to cover all of the games that I've played for the Game Boy, the NES, the Super Nintendo, Genesis, Dreamcast, N64, and PS1. There's a chance that I might have missed one of the WWF games on here. I think I got them all, but, I could have missed something, so if I did, please put it in the comments below. There might be a little recency bias on this one, but the Game Boy port of WWF Warzone was just awful. It isn't based on a game that's amazing. It was kind of an average game for the PS1 and for the N64, but the Game Boy port is just really bad. The controls are awful. The graphics look good, but everything's just really delayed. A lot of that has to do with, just it being a PS1 and an N64 port, and the developer trying to get it to work on only the black and white Game Boy. If it had been on the Game Boy Color, it might have been better, but no, this one was just all bad. There really was very little good in it after you got past the graphics. Next up is WWF WrestleMania on the NES. I have a lot of fond memories of playing this game with my friends, but when I went back to play it, I was rather disappointed with it. Many of the game's flaws are really hard to ignore now, especially when you look at the other NES games. While they weren't perfect either, they were all better than this. And many of the Game Boy games ended up being better than this one as well. If you don't have friends with you, this can be a pretty dismal experience, and yeah, that's why it's this far down on the list. I really wanted to enjoy it, but yeah, there's just not a whole lot here. WWF Raw on the Game Boy is a bad port of a game that I already didn't like. It has everything that I disliked about the two console versions of WWF Raw, but its graphics are worse, the controls are worse, and the roster is worse. It's just a miserable experience to play. It just barely beat out both WWF Warzone and WrestleMania on the NES. It's just a really awful version of a game that annoyed the hell out of me when I played it. This was one of the last Game Boy games that I played, and I'm glad that I was done with it. I could tolerate the controls for the Super Nintendo and the Genesis version, but here they were just absolutely awful. It looked like a good game, but in execution it was just really bad. WWF Attitude on the Game Boy Color, it's not a terrible version of a console game, but it's just fairly unremarkable to the point that I had forgotten all about it. Even though I had played it in the last few months, I just completely forgot that the game existed until I went back and was typing all this stuff up. What I do remember the most is that I like the graphics a lot more than the gameplay. This one kind of ends the spot where everything is bad. Now we're moving into the things that are kind of redeemable in some ways. This game, if anything, it made me want to go and play one of the console ports, which isn't really saying a whole lot because I think the console ports are pretty average. This one is just not all that great. If it was all you had, you might have liked it, but it's here for a reason. It's just not a very good game. WWF Superstars 2 is kind of a strange one. This is a port of WWF Steel Cage Challenge. At least, that was the way it felt while I was struggling through this one. It isn't the worst wrestling game that I played, but it has all the same problems as the other LJN wrestling games, especially those that are on the NES, and by proxy on the Game Boy as well. This version of the game has fewer wrestlers than the NES version, the controls are a little worse, and the graphics are understandably not as good. Some of this can be overlooked because it's on the Game Boy. Really, the big draw here is the steel cage, and even that isn't all that good. It's somewhat worse than the NES version. It's just a really weird game. I'm not exactly sure what's going on with it. All I knew is that I didn't like it all that much, and I liked the first one a lot more. So let's get WWF Steel Cage Challenge on the NES out of the way. It's a little better than the Game Boy version just because the graphics are a little better. It's not as zoomed in, the steel cage looks a little better. The characters are kind of the same. They're not really all that interesting, to be honest with you. Honestly, this game is just really like peak LJN. If I think of an LJN wrestling game, I'm thinking of Steel Cage Challenge because it just has a whole lot of laziness to it. All the characters play the exact same, they're all based on the exact same character sprite, and it's just an overall disappointing game with kind of rough controls, decent looking graphics, but just overall a very disappointing wrestling game. Next up is WWF WrestleMania Challenge on the NES, and honestly this should have been Survivor Series, or at least that should have been the title of this game. Because that's kind of the big draw for this one, is a Survivor Series match. That's really the best part of this. I find this game just to be really goofy. I do like the graphics quite a bit. The controls are alright. Just this isometric angle that they use is a little weird at times. It's overall a pretty decent wrestling game. It's not all that great, but if they had given this developer another chance, then it probably could have been better. It was better than some of the LJN games, but I didn't have as much fun with it as I did with King of the Ring. WWF King of the Ring on the Game Boy is actually a pretty decent game. I seem to be one of the few people that actually likes the NES game, and comparing this one to that, it's alright. I do like the character sprites. I think they're kind of a little goofy, and that's something that I enjoy in a wrestling game. The controls and the graphics here are alright for the Game Boy. It isn't anything special, but it's just okay. It's a faithful port of the NES game, and although it doesn't look as good as that game, it does have the same control scheme, which is pretty close. I did enjoy this one more than, really, WrestleMania Challenge, but not as much as the NES port of the same game. WWF King of the Ring on the NES is the game that I had the most fun with out of the other WWF wrestling games. It managed to beat out most of them just because, I kind of like this idea. I like the control scheme. I like the graphics more. I'm honestly one of the few people who seems to enjoy this game. I'm not entirely sure why. I like the cartoonish look of it. It doesn't look as good as WrestleMania Challenge, but I like this view a lot more than the isometric view in that game. Each character does have the same movesets, but that's not really a huge problem for me with this because everything just feels a little bit easier to do, and it's just a lot more fun than the other games on here. That's really the big thing for me that separated it, was my own enjoyment of the game. Honestly, I wish I had somebody else to play this with because that would have made it even better. That's part of the reason why I enjoyed wrestling games back in the day. I had so much fun with WWF Superstars on the Game Boy. This was the first wrestling game that I played for the Game Boy, and it was a pretty good experience for a handheld game. It's not amazing or anything like that, but it definitely wasn't terrible. I enjoyed this way more than most of the other wrestling games for the handheld, and really for the NES as well. This game has decent graphics and controls. The roster is fairly small, but you can kind of forgive that because this is on the Game Boy. It delivers on exactly what you would expect for a handheld wrestling game. It's pretty fun. It doesn't really throw a whole lot at you, but if you're just sitting in a car for 30 minutes, this would definitely get you through that, and that's really all you should be looking for in a handheld. WWF WrestleMania 2000 on the Game Boy was actually one of the better wrestling games for that system, and I think it's a little bit better than most of the NES games as well. The fact that it was compatible with the black and white Game Boy and the Game Boy Color was really kind of cool. I didn't think that they were going to be able to do that, especially when Attitude was a Game Boy Color exclusive. The developers really did an excellent job with this one. They got a lot of the console game in here, even if it does make me wish I was playing the console game. The controls were pretty good, and I did like the graphics quite a bit. Compared to some of the other Game Boy games, I think this one was better than those. And, yeah, better than the NES games as well. So that's kind of why it ended up here. WWF Super WrestleMania on the Super Nintendo is kind of a bare-bones experience. It feels and plays like a graphical upgrade of an NES game, which is kind of what you should expect for a game on a Super Nintendo at this time. All of the LJN games on the Super Nintendo and the Genesis really play the same, and I didn't enjoy any of them. They are ranking higher than the NES and the Game Boy games just because they look a lot better, and overall the controls are a little bit more responsive, even if I don't like the control scheme. So what separates this one from the Genesis game? I just think the Genesis one looks a little bit better, and I'll get into that one in just a second. Super WrestleMania on the Sega Genesis, I think, looks a little bit better than the Super Nintendo version. I also like the wrestlers that are in this game a little bit more. We're not really, arguing over anything significant here. This thing did lead me down a bit of a rabbit hole to find out more about Flying Edge, which I guess that was interesting, so yeah. I don't think this is really a great game. I think it's just an average one, just like the Super Nintendo version. The controls are decent enough. There are a few different wrestlers on the roster, and I like the look of it a little bit more than the Super Nintendo game. That's why it's ranked ahead of it. WWF Raw on the Sega Genesis is okay. I don't really like any of these games, to be honest. There isn't a huge gap between any of them, so a lot of this comes down to which one did I have fun with. Or at least which one did I have more fun with. And that's why, this version is ranking where it is. I liked it more than Super WrestleMania. I didn't like the control scheme all that much. I felt like it got a little worse, but the game does look better, and at least the controls were more responsive than in Super WrestleMania. Now we've got WWF Raw on the Super Nintendo. You can pretty much copy and paste a lot of what I said about the Sega Genesis version. I will say this, I think the graphics on the Super Nintendo one are a little bit better, and I had more fun with this version than I did with the Genesis version. I do like that they offer a bunch of game modes. Raw does have a lot more going on in it than, the other 4 LJN games on the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. So, yeah, there's that. I'm just not really a fan of these, so I'm trying to get through them as quickly as I can. Royal Rumble on the Super Nintendo doesn't have as many game modes as WWF Raw, but I do like the controls and the roster a little bit better than that game. I like this one a little bit more than Raw. It's still just kind of an average game. It's good enough, and it was good enough for the time. On the Super Nintendo, it probably would have been pretty good, but I didn't play it back then, so I don't really have any frame of reference for it. Well, I think it is the best of the 3 LJN games on the Super Nintendo. That doesn't really change how I feel about them all that much. There's a lot of issues that crop up with all of the LJN games, and many of those are here, even if I do think the controls and maybe the graphics are a little bit better than the previous 2 on the Super Nintendo. WWF Royal Rumble on the Sega Genesis was a little bit better than the Super Nintendo version. We're not talking like leaps and bounds here, it just was a little bit better for me. I thought the game was a little bit easier. I liked the graphics on the Genesis more than on the Super Nintendo, but that's really just a personal opinion for me. I also like the roster more. Anytime I can play as Papa Shango, I'm a very happy person. I have no idea why I'm drawn to that character, I just really like him. So yeah, I think the graphics are a little bit better than, the other LJN published games on, the Super Nintendo and then Flying Edge on the Sega Genesis. So yeah, that's why this one's here. You could really put these in any order that you want, and I wouldn't really argue with you. This is just where they came down for me. WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game, on the Super Nintendo, it was alright for what it was. I didn't like this one as much as the other two versions of it, but I did like it more than the other Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis games. Mostly the thing that was holding this one back was the roster size. You got more wrestlers in the other games, and really just like the lack of game modes overall. That kind of hurt the entire group of these games, but I did enjoy them more than the LJN/Flying Edge games in this. WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game on the Sega Genesis. Christ, these titles are getting longer. This one was a little bit better than the Super Nintendo version. Not by like a significant amount, but just having a bigger roster, that really helped this game out. It also felt a little bit easier, and that might have been because I kind of knew what I was doing at this point, and on the first one, or at least on the Super Nintendo version, I was still kind of learning how to do everything. The controls are pretty much the same. I didn't notice any significant differences. The graphics, I think, on the Genesis one look a little worse than the Super Nintendo, so really having a couple of extra wrestlers, that helped out the Sega Genesis version an awful lot. Overall, I was pretty disappointed with this version of WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game. The PS1 version looks really good. I think that's really what separates it from the Genesis version and kind of elevates it over that one. But aside from that, it really didn't do anything different than the other two games. It would have been nice if they had added something to this, like given you another game mode or something like that, but that just did not happen in this game. So it's better than the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis version, only because its graphics are better. So yeah, that's pretty much why it's here. WWF In Your House on the PS1 was the sequel to WrestleMania, the arcade game, but it wasn't released in the arcades, and it wasn't made by Midway. This was made by the developer that Acclaim was using to port the other games to their respective consoles. So, why is it above WrestleMania, the arcade game? Well, graphically it's not as good, but I still like the way it looks. It has more wrestlers, and it's got a, not necessarily better, but a much different roster of just the weird characters I remember growing up. So, yeah, there's a lot of nostalgia in this one. Even if I think, it's still really goofy, the goofiness really helped it out quite a bit. That's kind of why it's here. I had more fun with it than WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game, on any of the consoles that I looked at. The Dreamcast version of WWF Attitude is really rough. The story of the game's release and development is way more interesting than the game itself. Just about everything in this version of the game is the same or worse than the N64 and the PS1 versions of it. It had a rushed development because Acclaim was going to lose the WWF license, and it just kind of got thrown out onto the Dreamcast. The roster wasn't updated, the controls are worse than the other two versions of the game, and I think the graphics are pretty much on par with those two versions. I don't think it's too worse than the PlayStation version. I think it might be a little bit better than the N64 as far as graphics, but overall gameplay, it's the same tedious thing, but with worse controls. WWF Attitude on the N64 is a fairly average wrestling game. I don't think it's the worst game on that system by a long shot, because Nitro on the N64 is fucking horrible. This one is better than the Dreamcast version of WWF Attitude. I think it's better than WrestleMania the Arcade and In Your House, but it's not as good as the PS1 version of Attitude or Warzone. I just happen to like Warzone more. That's really just a personal preference. I think this game was fine for when it was released, but was very quickly passed up by the other WWF games. Speaking of WWF Warzone, I think the N64 version of this game is better than the Attitude version. I just think the controls are better, the graphics are pretty much the same, so yeah, I just overall enjoyed it more. It's less tedious than Attitude is, and I like the fact that it's sort of in between a simulation and more of an arcade experience. I also like it more than, the Dreamcast version of Attitude, which is pretty bad, and I like it more than, WrestleMania the Arcade and In Your House, just because there's more stuff to do here. It felt like they were moving towards a simulation, which really was the way they were going to go. It's just not as good as the PS1 version of Attitude or the PS1 version of Warzone. The PS1 version of Attitude is a game that I liked way more in the 1990s than I do now. I think it was a step towards what wrestling games would become. And, introducing that career mode was really cool, but it was just really frickin' tedious in this game. I still do like the game, but I don't think it's anywhere near as good as SmackDown, No Mercy, even Royal Rumble on the Dreamcast. I think this game is not as good as that one. And, yeah, I don't like it as much as Warzone on the PS1 either, so yeah, this is just another average wrestling game that just happens to be better than the other versions of WWF Attitude. So, yeah, take that for whatever it's worth. I went back and forth on just where to put Royal Rumble on the Dreamcast, because it's got a lot of similarities with, WrestleMania the Arcade game and also In Your House. This is a port of an arcade game that really excels on the one or two things that it does right. It's got great graphics, which are much better than the PlayStation 1 games and the N64 games. I think the gameplay is a lot more fun than those, but it has so few game modes that really kind of holds it back. It's got a lot of fun stuff in it, and I really enjoyed it, but I didn't like it as much as kind of the memories that I have for WWF Warzone on the PS1. So I stuck it right here in between the PS1 port of Attitude and also Warzone. WWF Warzone was a game that I really, really liked as a kid, and when I went back to play it for the reviews of it, and also for the ranking lists that it's been on, yeah, I really enjoyed playing it. I thought it was a lot of fun to go through. I didn't remember a lot of what was in it until I played it again, and yeah, I had so much fun with this. That's why it's really up as high as it is. I enjoyed it a lot more than WWF Attitude, all of the versions of that, and also the N64 version of Warzone. And yeah, it's not as good as the top games on this list, but for all the games that are kind of jammed in the middle here, this is the one that I enjoyed the most, and that's why it's here. There is quite a big gap between the average games and then the 4 best on this list. And honestly, I could have switched around these games into pretty much any order that I wanted to, and I would have been fine with it. I put WWF WrestleMania 2000 here because I have more memories with SmackDown. So, of the top 4 games on this list, I think this is the one that isn't as good as the others. It doesn't do anything bad. It's got a great roster. The controls are very easy to learn. I think as these games go on, this one just doesn't have as much content as the others. So it's behind SmackDown, No Mercy, and SmackDown 2. So now we come to WWF SmackDown. This is really a fantastic game. I played it a lot growing up with my friend Drew. I think it's got really good graphics. It's got great controls. I enjoyed this one way more than most of the games on this list. It's much better than Attitude and Warzone, much better than WWF WrestleMania the Arcade, and I think it's a little bit better than WrestleMania 2000. I'm really getting annoyed by just what WWF named all their freaking games. It's made this a little bit confusing. But in the number 3 spot from the top is SmackDown. WWF No Mercy was the best wrestling game on the N64. It's also a lot of fun to play. I found it really hard to kind of put this game down when I was writing up the review for it. It's right up there with SmackDown 2. I like it a little bit more than the first SmackDown and also WrestleMania 2000. I think they really improved on a lot of things between WrestleMania 2000 and this game. It's just a lot more fun to play than that one. So yeah, that's kind of why it's here. Graphically, I think it's pretty close to SmackDown 2. I'm going to give the edge to SmackDown 2 in that one. The controls are pretty much the same. Much of it comes down to the fact that I don't have any memories of playing this game when I was a kid, mostly because I didn't have an N64 and my friends who did had moved over to the PlayStation at this point, so we really played SmackDown 2 way more than this game. With all of that being said, I gave the final spot to SmackDown 2. I think it's the best wrestling game out of all of the WWF games on the NES, Super Nintendo, Game Boy, Genesis, N64, PlayStation 1, and Dreamcast. It was pretty close, but I've got more memories of playing this game than I do the others. I had more fun playing it when I went back to do the review for it. That's why it's taking the top spot. I really like the graphics, the gameplay is awesome, I love the career mode, it's just a really fun game to go back and play, and it was a nice way for really this series to close out their time on the PlayStation. The series would move to the PS2, and that is going to be a different list altogether when I eventually get to it. But yeah, for right now, SmackDown 2 is probably my favorite wrestling game. It'll definitely change because I'll have to go over the GameCube games at some point, or at least finish that, so we'll get to that at a later date. So that's going to wrap things up. Going through all of these again has really been a lot of fun. I missed out on most of these games when I was younger, and then when I started collecting retro games, I initially bypassed these and then circled back later on. There are a few of them that I think are terrible, but most of them are fairly average, or at least average for games at that time. Most of the really amazing ones, at least in my opinion, came on the N64 and on the PlayStation. And a lot of the really great ones, at least for the Dreamcast, never made it over here to the US, and they weren't licensed for WWF, so they would not have made it on here. It's been a lot of fun going back over these. I really love playing these again, just because of how different some of them are, and quite frankly, I had forgotten a few of them, and I had to go back and just kind of revisit them and figure out what was going on with those games. So yeah, just let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you put a game in a different order, just let me know that as well. Try not to be mean. I kind of want to keep it a little more lighthearted and happy here, but it is the internet, and I know that's not always possible for some people. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think. Talk to you later. Bye.